Hello, fellow teachers. Welcome to Teaching with Power. This is Ben Wilcox, and I want to thank you for letting me be a part of your scripture study or your lesson prep this week. My goal, as always, is to help you to study and teach the scriptures with more relevancy and power. This week, we're going to be covering Mosiah chapters 7 through 10. Remember, teachers, if you're interested in getting access to the materials that I put together for teachers to help reduce your preparation time, increase your confidence in the classroom, and help you to create edifying classroom experiences, just go to teachingwithpower.com and you're going to find links to those resources. And now, without any further ado, grab your scriptures and your marking pencils. It's time to dig deep. Well, if there is any book in the Book of Mormon that is the most chronologically complicated, it'd be the Book of Mosiah. It's a bit all over the place, and granted, a little hard to follow. You got a number of various journeys taking place in the Book of Mosiah. You've got simultaneous accounts running at the same time. You have flashbacks, and even flashbacks within flashbacks. And everybody seems to get lost in the wilderness at some point in the story. I mean, you're just not cool if you don't get lost in the wilderness in the Book of Mosiah. So if you're like me, and you can just picture it visually, tends to make a little bit more sense. So before we get into the real meat of the lesson, or the spiritual message of these chapters, I'd like to lead you through a brief visual overview of how the Book of Mosiah is put together as if it were told chronologically, at least up to chapter 24, because the narrative gets a bit easier to understand after that point. So we're going to pick up the story a number of years before King Benjamin arrives on the scene and travel back to about 200 BC when Benjamin's father, Mosiah I, has been appointed king over the land of Zarahemla. That's where the Nephite population is concentrated at this point. The Lamanites, on the other hand, they control the lands that Lehi had originally settled when he and his family first arrived in the Promised Land. And they called that land the land of Nephi, which is kind of ironic and confusing that the Lamanites actually inhabit the land of Nephi. So keep that in mind as you study the Book of Mormon. Chronologically speaking, the first chapter of Mosiah would be Mosiah 9. And at some point during Mosiah I's reign, a man named Zenith and a group of Nephites decide to enter the lands of the Lamanites and propose a treaty to inhabit the now decaying city of Lehi Nephi. And lo and behold, the Lamanite king agrees. He moves his people out of the area and allows Zenith and his people to occupy and rebuild the city. To Zenith, this is a pleasant surprise. Wow, the Lamanites are being awfully accommodating here. However, it's a trap, right? The king of the Lamanites is hoping that the Nephites will build up the area, and then later he's going to be able to attack them and put them into bondage before they get too strong. After a number of years, that's exactly what happens. The Lamanites do attack Zenith's people and attempt to overtake them. But they try twice and they fail twice. Zenith's people are able to hold them off and maintain the city. And that's going to take us all the way to Mosiah chapter 10. Now, Zenith eventually dies, but before he does, he confers the kingdom onto his son, Noah. Yes, that Noah, the infamous King Noah who reigns in iniquity with his cronies, the wicked priests. So the Lord sends a prophet by the name of Abinadi to warn them and call them to repentance. The story and teachings of Abinadi comprise chapters 11 all the way to 17. Eventually, though, Abinadi is burned by Noah. But just before Abinadi is burned, one of those wicked priests, a man by the name of Alma, believes Abinadi's words and has a change of heart, begins to stand up for him, which angers King Noah, and he orders Alma to be put to death. But Alma escapes and secretly goes about preaching Abinadi's words and leads a group of people to a place called the Waters of Mormon, where he baptizes them. That story is found in Mosiah chapter 17 to 18. But back in town, eventually the Lamanites are up to their old tricks again, and they decide to attack the land of Lehi-Nephi once more to accomplish their original design of putting them into bondage. And this time, they win. They conquer the city. King Noah is burned by his own people, by the way, not the Lamanites. And the people are planning on doing the same thing to the wicked priests, but they escape. Then Noah's son, Limhi, a righteous man, reigns in his stead as a sort of tributary monarch under Lamanite control. All of that is described in Mosiah chapter 19. In the meantime, while all of this has been happening, Alma has established a new city with his followers called the land of Helam. And there they are living in peace. That's described in Mosiah 23. But those wicked priests out there in the wilderness are getting a bit lonely, and so they decide that they need some wives. But I think they understand that they can't just walk into Lehi-Nephi or the Lamanite lands and start setting up dates. So they kidnap 24 of the daughters of the Lamanites and carry them into the wilderness. That's Mosiah 20. Limhi's people now. During their captivity, Limhi sends a group of men to try and find the city of Zarahemla, because at that point, they are under such strict taxation and bondage to the Lamanites that they just want any way out. But they don't know where Zarahemla is anymore. But those men that he sends don't find the city of Zarahemla. They get lost, like everybody does in Mosiah. But they do come across a land that is covered in bones and ruins. And what they've stumbled upon is the remains of the Jaredite nation from hundreds of years prior. Therefore, they return to the city of Lehi-Nephi, unsuccessful, resigned to their lot. That story is found in Mosiah chapter 21, verses 25 to 27. Now back in Zarahemla, during all these years, Mosiah has been succeeded by Benjamin, who has then been succeeded by Mosiah II. And Mosiah II decides to allow a man named Ammon and a group of others to try and find out whatever happened to the people of Zeniff, who had left all those years before. And in their search, they do stumble upon Limhi's people in the city of Lehi-Nephi. That story takes us all the way back to Mosiah chapter 7 through 8. Everything that we've been looking at so far between Mosiah 9 and 21 has been a flashback. Well, luckily for Limhi and his people, Ammon actually knows the way back to Zarahemla. Maybe they finally got smart and left a breadcrumb trail, something like that. But they devise a plan for Limhi's people to escape. The Lamanite guards are made drunk, and they sneak out through the city gates and make their way back to Zarahemla to join with Mosiah's people. That happens in Mosiah 22. Well, what about Alma and those wicked priests out there? An army of Lamanites is sent out to look for the priests that had kidnapped their daughters, which they do eventually find, and they're about to kill them. But somehow, the priests have convinced these girls to actually like them, and they plead for their husbands. The Lamanites are appeased, and surprisingly, they allow them to join them, the kidnappers. Well, they want to make their way back to their lands in the land of Nephi, but of course they get lost. And while they're out there wandering around, who do they happen to stumble upon but Alma and his people in the land of Helam? Now, they promise Alma that if he'll help them to get back to the land of Nephi, that they'll let them be free. Alma agrees and shows them the way. But they don't keep their promise. They do come back, and they put Alma's people in bondage. And in a cruel, ironic twist of fate, who do the Lamanites decide to put in charge over Alma and his people? None other than the wicked priests. That story takes place in Mosiah 23 through 24. Now, Alma and his people do suffer for a time, but they pray, and eventually the Lord sees fit to deliver them. A deep sleep comes over their guards, and Alma and his people make their way back to the city of Zarahemla, where they're welcomed by the people. And that's how Mosiah 24 ends. Everybody is back in the land of Zarahemla and safe. Well, I hope that was more helpful than it was confusing. There's certainly a lot happening within the pages of this book, and we're going to be referring back to this timeline over the next few lessons. And one quick point here. If there's a lesson to any of this, the fact that Mosiah has such a complicated timeline speaks to the fact, to me, that Joseph Smith really did translate the Book of Mormon and didn't just write it. Can you imagine trying to keep track of all those storylines and flashbacks and characters, and for it to all work out without any discrepancies or errors? That, to me, is a testament to the fact that this is a true account and not a work of fiction. It also augments one of the biggest lessons that we learn from the book of Mosiah. You might reflect on that whole turn of events and conclude, wouldn't it have been better had everyone just stayed in the land of Zarahemla? Then they wouldn't have had all of these complications. And to that, I say, yes, that's the key. Life gets complicated outside the walls of Zarahemla. And let's examine that theme a little more closely. For an object to this lesson, see if you can get your hands on a warning sign of some sort. Or you could just show this slide if you prefer. But if you'd like an actual sign to display, I'll put an Amazon link in the video description below to this particular warning sign that informs people not to climb over the fence, right? Then for an icebreaker, you could ask your students if they've ever been to the Grand Canyon before. You can inform them that sadly, on average, at least 1 to 2 people per year lose their lives by falling into it. Now, by and large, those incidents happen because people knowingly decide to leave the relative safety of the walkways, guardrails, and fences to venture out onto the cliffs and pinnacles at the canyon's edge in an effort to get impressive pictures or selfies to post on their social media accounts. They ignore the numerous signs and warnings, and they wander out into dangerous territory. And this isn't just a modern phenomenon. One of the first recorded incidents of people falling into the Grand Canyon happened back in 1925, when a man named Lewis W. Thompson set up his camera and walked back from it to get into the frame. While stepping back, he lost his footing and plummeted to his death. And since then, dozens of other tourists have climbed fences, ignored warnings, and then met the same fate as Lewis all those years before. One such instance is the story of Gabriel Comerford, who in 1999 asked some bystanders to take a picture of him while he clambered over the guardrail and out onto a rock pinnacle. Sadly, he too lost his footing and fell over the edge of the cliff. In fact, if you wanted, you could even show them a brief video of a close call, right? It shows 2 women out on the cliffs attempting to get a picture. And one of them is stepping backwards to get the picture, and she slips, but catches her balance just in time. Now you can click up here if you'd like to see that video really quick. It just goes to show, though, how easily and quickly things can go wrong when you ignore the warning signs. The moral of the story? Don't leave your places of safety. Life is better behind the guardrails. When we decide to ignore well-intentioned warnings, we place ourselves in enemy territory and perhaps put our very lives at risk. Now, these stories remind me a lot of the book of Mosiah. I just walked you through a brief history of the movements of all the various groups of people that we encounter in this portion of the Book of Mormon. And much of that story can be traced back to the decision of one man and a group of his followers who decide to leave Zarahemla to settle in Lamanite-controlled lands. Now, there's a negative way of approaching this story, and there's a positive one as well. We're going to do both. But we're going to start with the negative, and then we'll cover the positive. That one man, as I explained earlier in our summary, was Zeniff. And Zeniff is not a wicked man, but I might call him foolhardy, dangerously optimistic, or we're going to get a much better descriptive word for him in Mosiah chapter 7. That's where we'll begin. Mosiah chapter 7 is a great place to practice the skill of likening the scriptures. We're going to examine that story and see if it can teach us something that can help us with our own decisions. Therefore, we're going to liken the city of Zarahemla to the safety of the gospel of Jesus Christ, his restored church, or the commandments and counsels that it teaches. The lands of the Lamanites, on the other hand, we're going to compare to the world, or sin, or life outside the safety of Christ's church. If we look at it that way, what could Zeniff's actions represent? Let's compare that action to somebody that decides to leave the safety of Christ's path, his church, or the commandments and counsels of the gospel. Now, in that light, how many of you know a Zeniff? Somebody who has left Zarahemla. They've left the path. They've left the church. They've decided to ignore one or many of the commandments. Or maybe that person is you. Now, you've had the experience of being a Zeniff. You've left Zarahemla at some point. Or you're contemplating leaving Zarahemla. Or somebody you love is a Zeniff. However you approach this, with that perspective in mind, these chapters can teach us some deep and powerful insights. And we're actually introduced to the Zeniff story near its conclusion. In fact, 3 generations have passed since that fateful day when he and his followers leave the city. Zeniff is long since dead at this point, when we pick up the story at the beginning of Mosiah chapter 7. And I'm just going to summarize verses 1 through 16 and tell you that it describes the story of Ammon. Now, not the Ammon who cuts off all the arms. That's a different Ammon that comes later. But this is Ammon, a resident of Zarahemla, who leads a group of men to go out and look for what became of Zeniff and his people. Because since they had left all those years before, they hadn't been seen or heard from since. And King Mosiah II relents and allows Ammon and those men to set off into the wilderness to go and find their brethren. Which, if we're likening the scriptures here, Ammon could be a great symbol or example of those who seek to find and bring back the lost, to reactivate or rescue those that have left the fold. Sometimes that's what they need. They just need somebody who knows the way and is willing to lead them back to Zarahemla. And in Ammon's efforts, lo and behold, they do find Zeniff's people, or their descendants at least, and Zeniff's grandson, Limhi, is the leader now. And they discover that Limhi's people are in bondage to the Lamanites. Things are not good. But when Ammon shows up and tells them that they do know the way back to Zarahemla, it fills them with hope. And King Limhi gathers his people together for a speech. Starting in verse 17, King Limhi is going to do three things. One, he's going to do a recap of what he feels brought them to their current state, the mistakes that were made that led them to their current situation. Two, he's going to describe the consequences of those mistakes. Then he's also going to do one more thing. He's going to speak of hope. He's going to tell them what he feels they need to do in order to obtain their freedom once again and return to the land of Zarahemla. So that's what we're going to look for here. We're going to approach this as a marking activity. Encourage your students to pick 3 different colors and create the following labels in their scriptures. 1, the trap, or where did they go wrong? 2, the consequences, or what were the results of those mistakes? And 3, the hope. What did they need to do in order to escape those consequences? Then you can either encourage your students to read Mosiah 7:17 through 33 on their own, or you can read it as a class, or you can read it to them as a teacher, or you could play a recording of it from the church website or gospel library app. However you do it, number your students off as 1s, 2s, or 3s, and encourage them to search those verses from their particular perspective, looking for the trap, the consequences, or the hope. Then after you've read, ask your students to share what they found. What did they mark? And as you have that discussion, when they share a phrase, be prepared to ask them how we can liken that to ourselves. What can we learn from their example? What does that teach us about leaving the safety of the gospel and the church? And what does it teach us about getting back? Here are some of my thoughts. Zeneph begins with the message of hope. He says in verse 18, "Lift up your heads and be comforted." What a great way to begin. It's not with a reprimand, not with an "I told you so." It's be comforted. There's a way out. We can be freed from our enemies. What's the message to us? To those who may have strayed. Don't abandon hope. Satan wants you to hang your head low and fill you with despair. But there's no need for that. Be comforted. There's a way back. However, he also says, "I trust that there remaineth an effectual struggle to be made." We also need to keep that in mind. Coming back isn't always going to be easy. There may be some obstacles to overcome, habits to abandon, changes to be made, relationships to be severed. And I don't think it's so much an effectual struggle with God, but with ourselves. We've got to turn our hearts back to God. With Limhi's people, they're going to have to plan a risky escape. And then, even if it works, they're still going to have to make their way back through the wilderness to the land of Zarahemla. Getting ourselves back to Zarahemla, or leaving behind the lands of the Lamanites, is typically going to require an effectual struggle. But, verse 19, "Lift up your heads and rejoice." Put your trust in God, and this will work. Same with us. If we put our trust in God, He can deliver us. And then notice what Limhi says next. He gives 2 examples from the scriptures of peoples that God had delivered out of trouble. The children of Israel, Lehi and his family. What's the message there? We can find hope in the scriptures. They're going to help us to trust in God and give us examples of what God can do for us. If God can forgive an Alma the Younger or a Paul, then He can forgive me. If He can lead the children of Israel out of bondage, He can lead me out of spiritual bondage. If a prodigal son can return and be embraced by a loving father, then so can I. Scriptures are full of great examples of people returning. Then there's a shift in his speech. He's going to explain what he felt got them to that point, where they went wrong. So let's put away our hope color for a minute and pull out our trap one. At the end of verse 20, Limhi says that the reason that they're in their current predicament is a direct result of their iniquities and abominations. Sin is where they went wrong. It's just that simple. Disobedience to God's laws will eventually lead to undesirable ends in the long run. Though, an interesting point, Zeniff's people didn't end up in bondage immediately after they left Zarahemla. No, it's not until decades later that the bondage comes. There were probably times where Zeniff's people looked around and said, "Hey, I'm kind of glad we left Zarahemla. Things are good. What were all those Zarahemlaites so worried about? We're thriving. We're free. There's no issues with living in Lamanite lands." Well, the message for us might be that the consequences for leaving don't always hit immediately. There's usually a time period where maybe things seem to be okay. Things seem to be great. But don't be fooled. It never lasts. Eventually, the bondage will come. Verse 21 really gives a great description of how that often works. Limhi observes that his grandfather Zeniff was overzealous to inherit the land of his fathers. I think that's what happens to a lot of us when we leave Zarahemla. We do it because we're overzealous to obtain something that we want. Overzealousness often leads us to be rash in our decisions because whatever it is that we want it right now. We want to see what the world has to offer. We want to settle in the city of Lehi Nephi because it seems more exciting, more promising. We start to see the walls of Zarahemla more as a barrier than a protection. The issue with overzealousness is that there's always somebody waiting in the wings, ready to take advantage of that eagerness. Verse 21 tells us that Zeniff was deceived by the cunning and craftiness of King Laman. Well, who's our King Laman? The adversary, and his servants that do uphold his work. There are the cunning and the crafty who are ever ready to exploit our overzealousness. The alcohol and tobacco industry are always ready to feed our overzealousness to fit in or to feel good. The pornography industry is eagerly waiting to tell us that nobody gets hurt by its product. Hollywood produces filth and passes it off as entertainment by appealing to our basest natural man instincts. And the world may promise us ease and freedom from the work of Zion, the commandments, sacrifices, and the callings of Christ's church. And Satan himself is always there, ready to promise us freedom and pleasure and good times outside the city walls. All of the while chuckling under his breath, they're mine. Right? Beware of overzealousness. The wise temper their desires, bridle their passions, put off the natural man, and try to look further down the road with an eternal perspective to the long-term consequences of their decisions. Well, what does this deception bring them? Let's take out our consequences color. In verse 22, subjection, bondage, and they're forced to pay tribute to the king of the Lamanites. In verse 23, these things are grievous to be borne, bring great affliction, and give the people great reason to mourn. Verse 24 speaks of mourning again, and verse 25, he says that a great evil has come upon them. These are some of the consequences of leaving Zarahemla. And now they're trapped. And I've spoken to people in that trap. It is grievous. It is afflicting. It is to suffer a great evil. And my wife worked a long time in a rehab center for women. And she saw people every day who were bearing their grievous burdens, suffering great afflictions, and mourning over their past choices in the midst of their effectual struggle to get out. Bondage and severe taxation are a great metaphor for the consequences of sin. Why bondage? Well, sin always leads to a loss of freedom and agency. Satan sought to destroy our agency in the premortal realm, and some things never change. He's still trying to destroy agency. Sin leads to bondage. For example, I'll give you the sin and you give me the bondage. Start with an easy one. Alcohol, tobacco, and drugs. Where's the bondage? The bondage of addiction. Ask the person who's addicted to drugs, tobacco, or alcohol how free they feel. They've lost control. They no longer have the ability to say no to these things without a lot of help and a lot of work. They've lost agency. Lying, where's the bondage? And we get trapped by the lie. We have to cover it up or keep lying to maintain the legitimacy of the first lie. We got to keep track of all our lies and who we told what. Not to mention all the consequences that are most likely going to come when the truth comes out. The bondage of always worrying that we might get caught. How about pornography or gambling? Again, addiction. We feel we can't stop and they pull us deeper and deeper into their clutches. And then crime. Where's the bondage there? In that case, it can lead you to actual bondage or prison. How free do you think prisoners feel? Then maybe some tougher ones. How about anger? Where's the bondage there? How about the way we feel when we can't take back the things we said or that we did to somebody we love? Or our anger can lead to innocent people being hurt. How about not keeping the Sabbath day holy? The bondage of lost blessings, guidance, or isolation from God's people and church. And in each of these cases, there's always something that the adversary exacts of us. There's a tribute to be paid. What are the taxes of sin? When we break the word of wisdom, we pay with our health. With lying, we pay with a loss of trust. Pornography, our peace of mind, or our ability to have a meaningful relationship with an actual human being. Gambling, a loss of all our money. And then one of the biggest things we pay for, whatever sin we commit, is the companionship of the Holy Ghost. We lose the Spirit, which is a type of bondage all its own. We may have to pay with our happiness, our knowledge, our opportunities, our self-worth, our peace of mind. When you really stop to consider the consequences of sin, it's just not worth it, right? These things are grievous to be borne. Give us great reason to mourn. Or what if we're not looking at leaving Zarahemla as representing sin, but leaving the faith? Not everybody who leaves the church is out there committing terrible sins, right? But where's the bondage in that choice? The taxation. What's lost by making that decision? We forfeit all the wonderful blessings that the gospel has to offer us. The blessings of spiritual guidance, temples, scripture, truth, the unity and community of the saints, and so much more. Verses 24 through 28, I would place in the trap category, as Limhi states that the reason that they're in this situation is because of iniquity, once again. And if this people had not fallen into transgression, the Lord would not have suffered that this great evil should come upon them. And then after describing what they did to Abinadi, he says, therefore who wondereth that they are in bondage, and that they're smitten with sore afflictions? Sometimes it takes people a long time to come to that conclusion. Sometimes they fight against the consequences, or they deny the role of their decisions in bringing them to that point. Or they get angry with God, because the Lord will not always suffer them to take happiness in sin, as Mormon says later in the Book of Mormon. We'll take a closer look at this phenomenon in chapter 21. You'll see that it took Limhi's people a good amount of time to get to this level of humility and to accept that responsibility. They didn't get to that point quickly or easily. In verses 30 through 32, we find the fundamental principle of sin. This is the dark side of the law of the harvest. You reap what you sow. If you plant filthiness, you will harvest chaff in the whirlwind. But lest we get too discouraged with all of that, Limhi does end on a note of hope. Verse 33. But if you will turn to the Lord with full purpose of heart and put your trust in him and serve him with all diligence of mind, if ye do this, he will, according to his own will and pleasure, deliver you out of bondage. That phrase could be spoken to anybody in a modern day context even. There is an escape, a cure, a solution. Turn back to God. You'll be delivered. Our truth then, don't leave Zarahemla. Right? When we choose to leave the safety of the gospel, church, or commandments, it will only lead to bondage, tribute, and grievous burdens. But there's always hope and a way back. To take this message to heart, I'd encourage my students to ponder and ask themselves this question. Where do you see yourself in the story? Enjoying the safety and prosperity of Zarahemla? Hopefully that's where we are. Feeling overzealous to leave and explore the world outside the walls of the city? Leaving the city and feeling excited about the freedom that you expect to enjoy? Bearing the grievous burdens of bondage? Seeking to find or rescue the lost like Ammon? Or making your way back to Zarahemla in hope? And wherever we see ourselves, I hope that we can take the lessons that we've learned from Mosiah chapter 7 as guidance for what we can do next. As a conclusion to all of this, I would plead with all of those that are listening to choose to stay. Stay within the protective, secure walls of the city of God. Let's not jump the fences and wander out to the edge of the cliff because we think we're going to get a better view, or that it really can't be all that dangerous. Nothing's going to happen to us. Maybe it happens to other people, but not me. If I could sum up the major message of the entire book of Mosiah in just 3 words, I would say, don't leave Zarahemla, with an exclamation point. Beware of overzealousness. Heed the warning signs left by King Limhi and his people here in the book of Mosiah. It's best to stay in Zarahemla and far away from the lands of the Lamanites. However, if we ever do find ourselves in bondage, paying the heavy taxes of servitude, remember that there is a way out. Christ provides rescue and escape. We're going to take a look at how that escape takes place for Limhi and Alma's people later in Mosiah 21 and 24 and dive a little deeper into that principle. But remember, we can get back to Zarahemla. It's not too far. It's not too late. There is hope. One additional activity that you could do with this particular lesson is this handout. It's just a brief one, something simple, but it's a word search, but also a secret message activity. The challenge is to find all of the indicated words and then circle the letters that are left over or weren't a part of any of the words and enter them into the spaces below. When this is done, the secret message reveals itself. The solution to this puzzle is our big message, right? Don't leave Zarahemla. You see how that works? That could work really well with the family or with the youth. Now, Mosiah 8. I'm actually going to include the lesson from chapter 8 with next week's lesson, all right, if that's okay. Thematically, I like to pair chapter 8 with chapter 11 as we talk about a problem that we're going to call King Noah blindness. But still, let me give you a brief summary of what's happening here. Ammon shares with King Limhi everything that has happened back at home in Zarahemla since Zeniff left all those years ago. He fills them in on their history, and he even includes the teachings of King Benjamin. And then Limhi shares with Ammon their history and an interesting story, how he had sent out a group of men to try and find the city of Zarahemla. But instead, they had found the ruins of the lands of the Jaredites and a record of that people engraven on plates. but they were written in a language that nobody could interpret or understand. This is when Ammon informs Limhi that back in Zarahemla, there is somebody that can interpret records. There is a seer in Zarahemla. King Mosiah II, as a prophet, has the gift of seership and the Urim and Thummim to help him to translate things of that nature. And he explains to the king what a seer is and how blessed they are to have one in their midst. We'll talk more about that next week. But if you wanted to include that chapter in this week's lesson, you could easily connect it with the lesson we just talked about by making the point that one of the greatest reasons to stay in Zarahemla is that there is a seer there. When we leave Zarahemla, it's so much easier to get lost and blinded because you lose access to that perspective and the guidance that a seer offers. So stay in Zarahemla and trust the vision of the seer. His counsels and leadership can help us to avoid the bondage and taxation of living in Lamanite lands. But let's move on to chapters 9 and 10. The lesson from this section is the more positive approach to the decision that Zedek made to leave Zarahemla. A suggested object for this section of Scripture would be a pair of glasses. They could be prescription glasses, or sunglasses, or safety glasses, or glasses with colored lenses. And you could bring those glasses out and say that glasses change the way we see things. They can make things clearer. They can protect your eyes. They can modify the appearance of everything you look at. And the way we see things, the way we look at things, can make all the difference in what we think, believe, and how we act. Let's remember that today as we study a man who saw things differently than the others around him and the effect that it had. So an icebreaker that you might use for this would be to show a few headlines from world conflicts and atrocities that have occurred over the years. I try not to be too graphic or discouraging, but I think it's important to help your students recognize the reality of these kinds of situations in our world today, and the relevance the Book of Mormon has in helping us to understand and cope with them. So here are a few of the pictures that I would show, and I would ask us to consider the following question. What motivates people to do such terrible things to each other? Things like the Holocaust, suicide bombings, genocides, terrorist attacks. And whatever your thoughts on that topic are, I believe there's a phrase in Mosiah 10:17 that sums up these kinds of issues really well. Can you find it? We know that throughout the Book of Mormon, there are some terrible things that take place between the Nephites and the Lamanites. Atrocities committed, wars fought, many innocent people killed. What motivated those kinds of things? Well, it's hate, or at its most extreme manifestation, eternal hatred. That verse tells us that the Lamanites had an eternal hatred for the Nephites. And that means long-lasting, abiding, or persistent hatred. Enos gave us another great descriptive word for it. He called it a fixed hatred. To liken the Scriptures, is that problem relevant to our day? I believe it is. And can you think of any modern-day examples of eternal or fixed hatreds between people? Well, here's a few that I can think of. The Israelis and the Palestinians. That's a conflict that has been around for decades. For many years, it was Russia, or the Soviet Union, and the United States, which for a brief time, it seemed like things were getting better. Sadly, it seems like we're slipping more and more again into a Cold War-like antagonism. And what about the conflict between militant Islam and the Western world? Events like 9/11, bombings in Spain, France, London, and most recently, Moscow come to mind. On the other side of that conflict, there have been deadly attacks carried out on Muslims and Muslim mosques in Canada and New Zealand, other areas of the world. There are tribal factions in Africa that carry out horrific kidnappings and killings, with conflicts in Sudan, the Congo, Somalia, and Uganda. There's the Sunni-Shiite conflict within the Muslim world throughout the Middle East, which is a conflict that's been going on for centuries. We could point to race relations in America or South Africa, the drug wars in Mexico, or religious disputes between different faiths. These are just examples of that problem at the global or national level. What about gang conflicts, political strife, and even sports rivalries that have turned ugly in certain places? There are conflicts between neighbors, classmates, and even hatreds between siblings and spouses. Almost everywhere you turn, you'll see examples of hatred causing some of the most painful and destructive scenes in our modern world. Where does that come from? What is it that causes eternal and fixed hatreds to develop? How do people get to the point where they're willing to carry out such destructive and even murderous acts on other people, even on innocent individuals and children? Well, in Mosiah 10, Zeph's people are being attacked by the Lamanites, and he tries to help his people and us to understand why the Lamanites have this desire to destroy them. He's going to trace that hatred back to its genesis. And as we study his words, see if you can find any parallels between how the eternal hatred between Nephites and Lamanites developed to some of these latter-day eternal hatreds. We're going to look for some key words or phrases to help us understand that process. See if you can fill out this chart while we study Mosiah 10, verses 12 through 18. And in our last arrow, you can see our result, eternal hatred. Now, how do we get there? How do these things arise in our world? Starting in verses 12 through 13, can you see our first key word? What's the first step towards eternal hatred? They were a wild and ferocious and a bloodthirsty people, believing in the tradition of their fathers, which is this: believing that they were driven out of the land of Jerusalem because of the iniquities of their fathers, and that they were wronged in the wilderness by their brethren, and they were also wronged while crossing the sea, and again that they were wronged while in the land of their first inheritance, after they had crossed the sea. And all this because that Nephi was more faithful in keeping the commandments of the Lord. Therefore he was favored of the Lord, for the Lord heard his prayers and answered them, and he took the lead of their journey in the wilderness. Did you catch our word? Wronged. Our first step is that there is a real or perceived wrong that's taken place. One party feels like they've been mistreated or harmed in some way. With Nephites and Lamanites, goes all the way back to Nephi and Laman. Now, at this point in the Book of Mormon, that's about a 500-year-old conflict. And they're still referring to it. I think that all of the situations that we mentioned above can be traced back to some similar kind of incident, whether it's Palestinians and Israelis, militant Islam in the Western world, race relations. One side has been or felt wronged by the other. Now, after you feel like you've been wronged, what does that typically lead to? Let's find our next key word in Mosiah 10, 14 through 16. And his brethren were wroth with him because they understood not the dealings of the Lord. They were also wroth with him upon the waters because they hardened their hearts against the Lord. And again they were wroth with him when they had arrived in the promised land because they said that he had taken the ruling of the people out of their hands, and they sought to kill him. And again they were wroth with him because he departed into the wilderness as the Lord had commanded him, and took the records which were engraven on the plates of brass, for they said that he robbed them. Key word there, wroth. You feel wronged and it makes you wroth, angry with the other person or group. Now the rest of the key words all appear in verse 17. Feeling wroth towards somebody leads to another emotion. What is it? And thus they have taught their children that they should hate them, and that they should murder them, and that they should rob and plunder them, and do all they could to destroy them. Therefore they have an eternal hatred towards the children of Nephi. I'm going to say that the word hate comes next. When anger is planted, hatred is grown. And then that hatred leads to what? Murders, robbing, and doing all that you can to destroy them. Let's call it the will to destroy. And that's where we get horrific acts like 9/11, the Holocaust, wars, terrorism, and killings. Now, I believe there's one more step here between the will to destroy and eternal hatred. And it's probably the most sad and the most tragic. Look very closely at verse 17 and see if you can find the step that turns hatred into eternal hatred or fixed hatred. What is it that perpetuates hate for years and even centuries? They teach their children to hate. How sad is that? When you take an impressionable and innocent child and plant in its mind and heart hatred for other human beings. That's what makes these conflicts drag on and on forever, making it almost impossible to eradicate. Where the conflicts of the grandparents' age become the conflicts of the child's age, and then the grandchild's age. They become generational conflicts, perpetual conflicts, eternal conflicts. I remember reading a news story a number of years ago where the mother of a Palestinian suicide bomber was being interviewed by a news agency. Her son had gotten onto a crowded bus with a bomb strapped to his chest and blown it up, killing most of the Jewish passengers on board. Well, the interviewer expressed his condolences for her loss, to which she replied with something like, "Oh, I'm not sad at all. I'm proud of what he's done. I have a 10-year-old son that I hope dies in the same way." And I think, really? How terrible. Her hatred was so strong that she hated her enemies more than she what? More than she loved her own children. That's strong hatred. That's eternal or fixed hatred. Another story that comes to mind was told by Frederick W. Babel, who toured Europe after World War II with Ezra Taft Benson. He tells a story where the parents of a 3-year-old deaf child came seeking a priesthood blessing from him. He relates the story like this. "Before I could say a word, I was told by the Spirit that this young boy could be healed this very night if his parents would lose the hatred which they had in their hearts. I was decidedly shocked and troubled, because I had never before met this family and did not want to question their attitude. But I was restrained from sealing the anointing. After a moment's pause, I removed my hands from the boy's head and said to the parents, 'What is it that you hate so deeply?' They looked startled. Then the husband said, 'We can't tell you.' 'I don't need to know,' I replied. 'But as I placed my hands upon your son's head, I was assured that he might be healed this very night and be restored to you whole if you will only lose the hatred which you have in your hearts.' After some troubled glances back and forth between the couple, the husband again spoke. 'Well, if that is the case,' he said, 'our son will have to go through life as he is, because we won't give up our hating.'" Hatred is truly tragic. And those hatreds, I'm afraid, will most likely continue on forever and ever until parents learn to love their children more than they hate their enemies and stop teaching their children to hate. I hope that there's nobody watching this video that's fallen into this trap. But if you have, is there any hope for situations like this? How do you cure eternal hatred? Are there any possible solutions to this problem? I believe there are. Let's fill out the second chart now, and you'll notice that I haven't framed this one as a process. so much as a list of different things that I believe can help eternal hatreds to be solved. One part of the solution I've already mentioned above. Stop teaching hatred to children. That's one way. Another part of the solution I feel is found in chapter 9. I call it seeing with Xenoph's eyes. The only way these eternal hatreds can be solved is if we begin to see with Xenoph's eyes. What do I mean by that? Read Mosiah 9:1, looking for how Xenoph saw the Lamanites. What glasses did he have on when he looked at them? And pull out the glasses that you brought at this point. Were they eternal hatred glasses? Judgmental glasses? Exploitative glasses? What can you find? Verse 1 says that when Xenoph goes down with his group of spies, initially with the intent to destroy the Lamanites, he says, "When I saw that which was good among them, I was desirous that they should not be destroyed." That, to me, is the first step to solving these kinds of problems. We've got to change the way that we view our supposed enemies. Stop looking for the faults. Stop looking for the negative. And start looking for what's good in them. You might remember Jacob making that point back in Jacob chapter 4. We've talked about this already. Look for the good in the other side. Other nations, other cultures, other religions. Look for the good in your spouses, your children, your neighbors, your ward members. If you look for it, you're certain to find it. Maybe that's why Christ taught us to pray for our enemies. Conditions the mind to look for the good within them. If the Israelis would look for the good in the Palestinians, and the Palestinians would look for the good in the Israelis, maybe that problem could begin to be resolved. If the Sunnis could look for the good in the Shiites, or vice versa. Whites and blacks, the Democrats and Republicans, estranged siblings or husbands and wives. Any kind of conflict can begin to be resolved when opportunities are sought to see the good. The next step I see is in verse 2. Xenoph desires to make a treaty with them. So seek to find a resolution to your conflict. Seek to understand why they feel wronged or wroth. Perhaps you can find a win-win solution to your problem, or at least an acceptable compromise, which, granted, is difficult and complicated and requires a great deal of patience and negotiation. But that's far better than the violent alternative. Then solution 3, I see, comes later in verse 5. Can you find anything there? We learn there that Xenoph desires to possess the land in peace. Xenoph was certainly an idealist, right? He wants to put the past behind them. He believes, sincerely, that Lamanites and Nephites could live side by side in peace. Now that reminds me of an experience that I had while visiting Ireland. Maybe some of you are familiar with the saying, "to chance your arm." Well, I discovered the origin of that phrase while visiting St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. I was walking around the cathedral when I saw an old door on display with a large hole cut out of the middle of it. Caught my attention. I decided to read the placard that was next to it. It said that in 1492, there were 2 Irish families in the middle of a bitter feud, the Butlers and the Fitzgeralds. Offenses had been committed on both sides, and as the conflict got more and more out of hand, the Butlers sought refuge from the attack in the cathedral, while the Fitzgeralds surrounded the building. After some time, for tempers to cool off and for reason to return, the head of the Fitzgerald family pounded on the door, telling the Butlers that they could come out, that he wanted to make peace. The Butlers refused, thinking that it was just a trick to get them to come out so that they could be slaughtered. They refused to open the door. That's when the leader of the Fitzgeralds ordered that a hole be cut in the door, after which he reached his arm through and offered a handshake for peace. Now you can see the risk in that, right? If the Butlers wished, they could very easily have cut off his arm. But this gesture, this chancing of his arm, convinced the Butlers that he was sincere. And I'm sure that must have been quite unsettling thing to reach his defenseless arm through the door into the darkness. You can just see him cringing and hoping. But what a relief when he felt that other hand grasp his in a token of peace. The door opened and the conflict resolved. I believe that a lot of the world's conflicts could be solved if one side would sincerely and willfully chance their arm, so to speak, and offer a treaty of peace. With that in mind, I encourage you to reflect on your own life. Now, you may not be able to do anything about the world's conflicts, but are there any conflicts or hatreds that you have been caught up in? Is there another individual or group of people that you are hostile towards? In your family, in your ward, in your community, and the world in general? If so, I encourage you to learn from this story and consider the following question. Is there any way that you could apply Zeph's example to your own life? If so, how? Are any of his solutions applicable to your situation? And if they are, how could you implement them in your own life? Maybe it's just to ponder and find the good in them. Maybe it's hammering out and negotiating through an acceptable treaty or workable compromise. Or maybe it's believing in and devising a way to live in peace, side by side, with somebody who sees things differently than you. To disagree without being disagreeable. To challenge ideas, not individuals. To make a treaty or chance your arm. To establish peace. To be what President Nelson recently encouraged us to be. Peacemakers. And at the very least, don't preserve hate into the next generation or perpetuate a heritage of hate. Let the conflict end with you. Now, before we end, I can imagine that some of you are wondering about my conclusion here. Somebody could very well argue and say, but wait, Zeph's experiment failed, Brother Wilcox. The only reason the king of the Lamanites made a treaty with him was so that he could later take advantage of him. It was all a trick. Perhaps he would have done well to heed the Savior's advice when he instructs us to be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. But you very well could argue that Zeph's idealism and overzealousness betrayed him. See, you can't eliminate eternal hatred even if you try. In fact, one of the saddest problems with trying to see the good in your enemies is what happens in verse 2. Therefore I contended with my brethren in the wilderness, for I would that our ruler should make a treaty with them. But he, being an austere and a bloodthirsty man, commanded that I should be slain. But I was rescued by the shedding of much blood, for father fought against father, and brother against brother, until the greater number of our army was destroyed in the wilderness. We returned, those of us that were spared, to the land of Zarahemla, to relate that tale to their wives and their children. Now, how do some of our own people react when we try to see the good or make peace with the enemy? We become the enemy now. Conflict is no longer a horizontal conflict between you and your enemy, but now it creates a vertical conflict within your own community. National wars become civil wars. Your own kindred might turn against you. And they say things like, any friend of my enemy is also my enemy. And it just goes to show how difficult a problem like eternal hatred can be to get rid of, and how hard we've got to work not to let them get started in the first place. Modern examples of this, when Anwar Sadat of Egypt decided to make peace with Israel. He was assassinated. But who assassinated him? Israelis? No, some of his own people. When Yitzhak Rabin wanted to make peace with the Palestinians, he was assassinated. By who? Palestinians? One of his own people. This happens on a more personal scale as well. I remember a coworker who told me that his wife's parents had cut ties with one of her brothers, for whatever reason. Well, she decided to speak on behalf of her brother to try and smooth things over. Unfortunately for her efforts, she too was cut off from her parents' contact for the mere act of standing up for it. It's really sad how these kinds of things can escalate. Is it even worth it to try? Does the world have any hope for curing eternal hatred? I still think that it does. The answer comes later in the Book of Mormon. The sons of Mosiah are a good example. They decide to go into the Lamanite nation and teach them the gospel. And many of them laugh them to scorn. But they go anyway. And does it work? Yes and no. They are able to convert a large portion of the Lamanite nation, King Lamoni and his father. They succeed with them. But again, we have an example of horizontal conflict becoming vertical conflict, where those Lamanites that have not been converted start to slaughter those that have, the people that become known as anti-Nephi Lehis. So maybe that suggests that you can conquer eternal hatred in individuals, but maybe not in entire nations. But eventually, later in the Book of Mormon, the idealism of both Zeniff and the sons of Mosiah is going to be vindicated when two idealistic brothers by the names of Lehi and Nephi, who are able to see with Zeniff's eyes the good, manage to teach and convert the entire Lamanite nation. So much so that the Lamanites give up their conquered lands and make peace with the Nephites. And you have this wonderful portion of the Book of Mormon where there are no conflicts or wars between the two cultures. And what is it that worked? What really is the only solution to the world's eternal hatreds? It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the only lasting solution. I believe that missionaries do more to create peace in this world than all armies, charities, governments, peacekeeping forces of the world combined. In this world full of conflict and hatred, I almost can't stand to watch the news anymore. It's too discouraging. I look forward to the day when Jesus Christ will return and reign over this world in total peace and harmony. Until that day, I hope that we can all seek to look for the good in all, to find resolutions in conflict by chancing our arm, maybe, so that we can live in peace with one another and spread the gospel of Jesus Christ far and wide, the only true solution to the world's endless problems. As I've traveled to different parts of the world, I've come to the conclusion that this is possible. There are so many good people out there in the world, more good than bad. It's made me optimistic about human nature. And though it may sound trite and a bit cliche, I do pray for world peace. And I know that one day it will be possible through the power and love and atonement of Jesus Christ. That will conclude our lesson for this week. I really appreciate you taking the time to study with me. And I pray that you felt the Spirit. And I also hope that you found inspiration and motivation to apply what the Scriptures have taught us. Thank you so much for watching. Now get out there and teach with power.